Hi, this is Brian Russell, and I want to give this lecture on New Testament context. It follows our blitz through the ancient Near East. I'm going to try to get through this material quickly, simply to connect us from the Old Testament times into the New Testament. Now, what are the contexts for the New Testament? These try to answer two questions. Is there a context that's behind our New Testament text that can give further meaning to what I'm reading? And number two, have I thought about the layers of meaning and the different possibilities for reading these texts? These are always going to be two key questions. And the background for the New Testament is obviously going to be the Old Testament, which we'll be looking at in due course. But it's also the history. And the two pieces that are going to be a little bit different from our Old Testament context are going to be the influence of Hellenism, which comes with Alexander the Great's conquering of the Near East, and also with the rise of the Roman Empire. So we're going to see those developments as we look through these materials. Now we'll back up, and some of this is going to be a review from our Old Testament talks. But again, the roots of the New Testament come with essentially the Babylonian exile, 587, and then the return from exile that happens following the rise of the Persians. As we saw earlier, Cyrus the Great issues an edict. He allows the Jews to come back to their land. The temple ends up being rebuilt, and we enter into the era of Second Temple Judaism. And as we get closer to the New Testament, we're going to see Judaism splits into competing parties. We're going to have Jews who've remained in exile or who are part of a diaspora around the Mediterranean world. We're going to have Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, Essenes, and then just regular folks that are going to be living in Palestine. So there's a lot of diversity during this period. Now, the Persian Empire grew massively. And you can see that line from the book of Esther, Ahasuerus, who reigned from India to Ethiopia. Here's a picture of the extent of the Persian Empire. And look at this. It goes all the way from essentially the Indus River over here on the east side going into India. And at its heyday, the Persians even invaded the Greek islands, and they had control of North Africa. So just a huge portion of territory. Now, Persia declined essentially because it overextended its reach. It wasn't able to conquer Greece, and under the impetus of their victory over the Persians, Greece becomes a force. And in Greek thought, there was an emphasis on humanity, philosophy, like under persons such as Socrates, Plato. We have the rise of Stoicism, Epicureanism, lots of different modes of philosophy. Also law, medicine, mathematics, and a real emphasis on individualism. Alexander the Great lived at the end of the 4th century, and we mentioned him in our earlier lectures that were given the background to the Old Testament. You may not know that Alexander was taught by actually Aristotle, believe it or not. So he had a fantastic education, and essentially he becomes a king over Macedonia and takes an army out in campaigns, and over about 10 years, Alexander takes out the entire Persian Empire and is able to win great victories. And he makes it all the way to the India by 327, but then just a few years later, at the ripe old age of 33, he dies in Babylon. But again, Alexander conquers the known world, and what we're going to see, the other great thing that's going to happen is Caesar Augustus, who's going to be the great Roman emperor at the time of the birth of Jesus, he's going to organize all the things that Alexander conquered. So this is an important backdrop to the New Testament, is Alexander conquering the known world. And Alexander, as he moves into the Near East, carries Greek language, Greek customs, Greek cities and people, Greek coins, philosophy, and society in the Near East becomes heavily influenced by Greek ideas. This is called Hellenism and Hellenization. The Greeks called themselves the Hellenes, and so they wanted to Hellenize the rest of the world. And part of this process, following Alexander's death, is his empire breaks into 4 pieces. Now, this had 3 empires, the Ptolemies, who were in Egypt. The most famous Ptolemy probably of all time would be Cleopatra. The Seleucids in Syria, Asia, and the Antigones back in Macedonia. And here you can see how it originally was broken up. And again, Palestine's right here in the middle is what we're going to see. Essentially, the Seleucids are going to ultimately run this area. And we're going to see God's people, the area of Palestine, is going to be stuck between the Ptolemies and a little bit later the Seleucids. Here's some dates that you can look at. And what we see over these next couple centuries is a fight back and forth between the different empires that picked up the vacuum that was created, or filled the vacuum that was created by Alexander's death. And God's people in Israel, they essentially functioned as a city-state centered in Jerusalem, where they're able to practice their religion. The priest becomes very crucial, and essentially they were governed by outside powers, but they had some freedom as a temple state. But the problem for God's people during these centuries was sometimes they're under the Ptolemies, other times they're under the Seleucids. And when we get to closer to about 200, the Seleucids gain power over Palestine. Now, this was both good and bad. They supported the rebuilding of the temple. They made provisions for sacrifices. They gave some tax exemptions. They reduced some of the tribute, and they reduced taxes, and they set slaves free and let Jews practice their religion. This is all great until problems happen. The Seleucids begin to have to battle against the Roman Empire that's beginning to encroach on their territory. And once this happens, taxes slowly begin to be raised on the provinces, and they gain more control over those. And that's going to have real implications, and it's going to be a flare-up. Because what happens around 166 is a man named Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, becomes ruler of the Seleucids. And he doesn't like God's people. He doesn't like the Jews. And not only is he raising taxes, but he's beginning to do things to seriously oppress Jewish people, including desecrating the temple. In the New Testament, Jesus is going to talk the abomination that causes desecration. And in some ways, he's thinking about what Antiochus had done. He literally sacrifices a pig in the Holy of Holies. Takes the temple, he takes the temple furnishings, and this creates a rebellion. You can imagine if somebody did something to one of the holy sites in Jerusalem today, what kind of action would take place? It probably literally create some kind of World War III. So this is a huge revolt takes place. This is known as the Maccabean Revolt, and over a series of wars over almost 20 years, God's people free themselves for a short time and enjoy some local autonomy. And as we can see, the Hasmoneans, this is what the empire is going to be called. The Maccabeans create a dynasty that's going to reign for almost 100 years. And this is the only time that God's people actually have autonomy in the Holy Land, really until 1948, when the modern nation of Israel creates a self-governing nation for Jewish people. Now, slowly at the same time, the Roman Empire is moving outward from Rome and beginning to conquer the Mediterranean world, and ultimately it's going to be the Near East. And 64 is a key date for our understanding of 64-63. We have the Romans taking control of Palestine. The Hasmonean dynasty is left in place in some ways, but they're no longer in control. And Pompey rules. Julius Caesar takes control of the empire. And actually, this is the point at which the Roman Republic is dissolved and Rome becomes an empire. Julius Caesar's son, Octavian, takes over the empire. He defeats Antony and Cleopatra and ushers in the full-blown Roman Empire that gives us our background. Octavian takes the title of Augustus, He's King of Kings and Lord of Lords. When we read the beginning of Luke's Gospel, you can see some intentional contrast between the humble Jesus born in a manger with the powerful one ruling out of Rome. Octavian spends his reign consolidating the power, building the government and the infrastructure. He creates the Roman road system that's going to be crucial for the spread of the gospel. This connected connected the entire Roman Empire to Rome via roads. This was, of course, so the army could travel out to keep things under control, but it created trade routes that were safe, and it's going to ultimately be those roads that Paul and the other apostles are going to walk and as they carry the gospel over the world. And Caesar Augustus establishes this peace of Rome. Again, it's a brutal dictatorship, but it's relatively peaceful. And this is the perfect time then for the Messiah and Savior of the world to come into the world in Jesus. And so as we sum things up, these events lay the historical background for the coming of Jesus. He's born into a world that's under the oppression of the Roman Empire. He's going to be a different kind of king and a different kind of Lord, not through power, but through death on a cross. Jesus comes after centuries of battles and wars as one empire followed another. He comes at a time when there's been lots of changing of leaders, continual rebuilding, and he comes as a new empire begins to rule. There's tensions without and within, and Jesus, our Savior, comes to our world at this time.